The following podcast was produced in-house for KQEK.com. Please note the following podcast features extensive flashing and strobing imagery over the excerpted bonus audio. Viewers may wish to minimize or maximize the experience at their discretion. Details on their creation and links to further info and HD extracts appear at the end of this podcast and on KQEK.com's iTunes, Libsyn, and YouTube channels. Back on October 30th, 2012, the TIFF Bell Lightbox did a one-time screening of their 35mm archival print of Julian Roffman's 1961 3D CanCon classic, The Mask. And in the two imminent audio excerpts, you'll hear the pre-screening intros in which the film is hailed as Canada's first feature-length horror film and first feature-length 3D film. A note to 3D connoisseurs. Norman McLaren beat Rothman to the finish line in the 1950s with 4 stereoscopic NFB shorts that were recently restored and screened at the TIFF Bell Lightbox in 2015. O Canada, Twirlygig, Around is Around, and Now is the Time were showed in conjunction with a new documentary on McLaren's compositional work, Norman McLaren, Animated Musician. The 3D Film Archive have tackled a number of marvelous restorations, putting many on Blu-ray, including McLaren's Around is Around on their 2015 collection, 3D Rarities, which I'll be reviewing at a later date. The 2012 screening also preceded the film's restoration that was undertaken in part by TIFF and the 3D Film Archive, and the final results debuted in late 2015 on Blu-ray and DVD via Kino, a home video release with which I have some issues that are addressed in a separate review at KQEK.com. The restored Mask also enjoyed a theatrical run in October of 2015 at the TIFF Bell Lightbox, including one evening tied to the book launch of the Canadian horror film Terror of the Soul, an anthology of essays edited by Gina Freitag and Andrea Loiselle, published by the University of Toronto Press. A longer excerpt from that screening's intro is also within this podcast, but for now, let's flip back to 2012. At the time, Rothman was known as the director and producer of The Mask, and the solid bio featurette on Kino's separate Blu-ray and DVD releases certainly helps emphasize his pioneering efforts to establish a Canadian film industry outside of the NFB, where he learned to cut his teeth as a filmmaker. Rothman's yearnings for a commercial film industry weren't unique, and I'm sure that although he felt indebted to the great opportunities offered by the NFB, no country's cinematic expression should be restricted to one genre. It's an extremely narrow-minded stance that allowed the Canadian government to foster a select aspect of a film industry, short films and documentaries, but pretty much handed over control to American distribution combines that had little interest in showing or investing in a local industry. Whereas horror features had been produced in Hollywood back in the silent era, Thomas Edison's compact retelling of Frankenstein in 1910 comes to mind, it took us a few more decades to make our own commercial mark in 1961. And when that happened, in typical Canadian fashion, snooty critics and tightwad bureaucrats likely felt a sense of embarrassment that Hoffman, a former NFB man, made a gimmick-laden, commercially successful film that was exhibited in the United States by Warner Brothers. In his must-read tome on Canadian film, They Came From Within, Calum Vadenstyle chronicled the rather brutal career of William Fruitt, initially beloved by critics for co-writing with Don Shabib Going Down the Road in 1971, but shunned, if not excoriated, for writing and directing the nasty 1976 rape-revenge thriller Death Weekend, also known as The House by the Lake, because it was commercial, exploitive, and packaged grotty nihilism within a slickly told but grainy docudrama package. In a coming review of Death Weekend, I'll have some related audio material to contextualize another CanCon film that received a VHS release but is available nowhere. With The Mask, Rothman made the kind of financially successful picture the government tried to foster in the 1970s and 1980s via tax shelter productions, and he also succeeded creatively by being innovative in his use of 3D, and that subject is the main focus of the intro extract from 2012 in which TIFF curators discuss the fragility of their print. It gets a bit dry and technical near the end, but the intro certainly makes it clear that outside of the library archives of Canada in Ottawa, surviving prints of pre-tax shelter films are extremely rare.
Good evening. Welcome to TIFF celebration of UNESCO World Day for Audiovisual Heritage. My name is Sylvia Frank, and I'm the director of the Film Reference Library and Special Collections. And this is my colleague, Julie Lofthouse, who's our film archivist. Some of you may not be aware that TIFF has a significant research library on the fourth floor of this building. It's open to the public and scholars alike, and it's free. The mandate of the library is to foster appreciation for cinema heritage and preserve Canada's film legacy. The library's collections include books, press kits, lobby cards, posters, and reference copies of films, and archival collections such as the personal archives of key Canadian filmmakers like Adam Egoyan, David Cronenberg, Patricia Rozema, and others. Another important collection is the film archive, which includes films that we screen year-round, and some very rare prints, such as the one you will see this evening. UNESCO designated the World Day for Audiovisual Heritage to publicize the need to preserve the world's cinema. Film is approximately 116 years old, yet of the first 20 feature films produced in Canada, only one is still in existence. The film you will see this evening is already 50 years old. In fact, it was 50 years ago from today that it was reviewed in Variety magazine. It's one of the few existing prints that we are aware of, and that is why we have not screened the print until tonight. Since we cannot find the original elements, we know that it is truly an archival print at the moment, a unique record. We decided that the best way to champion the need to do everything possible to keep films from disappearing is to get the word out. While TIFF does not have the facilities or resources to restore films, we do as much as possible to preserve prints that have come our way through donation, and The Mask is such a film. The film was made in 1961, and it was a groundbreaker. It was made in Canada, but it was the first Canadian feature to receive a wide distribution in the States, and it was Canada's first horror film. So I think I need to verify that. It used 3D sequences that were unique and have been acclaimed. In the time that I've been in this position at TIFF, I've received many requests to screen the print, but fearing any undue wear to the print, we have not screened it, and we have basically kept it in a climate-controlled facility. Unfortunately, the public will not be able to see the film again after tonight until it is restored, and that is a pity, since it is a key film in the Canadian canon. Tonight we have with us Peter Rothman, who's the son of the director Julian Roffman, and I know that he is concerned about further deterioration to the print and shares with us the desire to have his father's legacy preserved for future generations to study and enjoy. Welcome, Peter, and thank you for being here. And now Julie is going to explain some of the technical details about this print, because it's a different type of 3D than you're used to these days, and she'll talk about the condition of the print.
Thanks, Sylvia. So while the boom of 3D first hit in the 1950s, many people would be surprised to know that stereoscopic photography, the science behind such 3D films as The Mask, actually dates back to the mid to late 1800s. There have been numerous systems utilized for 3D imaging throughout the years. The process utilized in The Mask is anaglyph and actually dates back for early tests as far as 1915, 1919. For those who are not familiar with it, the anaglyph system employs the use of two color layers, in this case red and blue, or more technically red and cyan, which are superimposed but offset with respect to each other. Now, how this produces a 3D effect is that each eye sees perspective a little bit differently. So viewing the image through the same color filters, in this case your 3D glasses, are used for the offset images on the film strip, and it tricks the brain into approximating a depth or a three-dimensional effect. From information gathered, we know that The Mask was shot on 2D but employed a dual camera system for the 3D sections. So the sections that are not in 3D are printed on black and white film stock, while the 3D sections, which required printing on color stock, were done by way of a single-strip Technicolor system. Both stocks were eventually edited together for the making of the release print. The single-strip system means that the film strip, when printed, would go through multiple passes, each time through a different filter, which would do a layering of images on top of each other. Now, it's not like stenciling or applying other dyes on top of the image, but instead it's allowing the emulsion to be exposed to different light spectrums during each printing pass. Now, keep in mind that ensuring everything lines up exactly, otherwise known as registration, when using any type of separation or multiple pass is crucial for the work to actually work. Color film, particularly of this type of stock, Eastman color, which is what was available at the time, and generation issues are well documented as being susceptible to color fading. Once started, color fading cannot be reversed. It can only be slowed down through the proper storage conditions such as Sylvia mentioned earlier. For the most part, the film stock in this print is really in good condition, especially considering that it is 50 years old. And the color can be considered moderate to good, however, some fading is definitely noticeable. That said, you might find that some of the 3D sections in the film work a little bit better than others. Now, having conducted a careful archival inspection, I suspect actually there's multiple issues at play here. That there is some color fading, but there may also be some registration issues. So color fading could reduce the effectiveness of the optical illusion because all three parts aren't working in unison. They're not working equally. However, given when I was looking at the film frame by frame, the color in the anaglyph portions of the frame still look pretty good. It kind of lends to the theory that there may have been some registration issues when it was printed. So during the inspection, I also noticed that at least one section where there was a registration error between the frame line and the soundtrack, where the frame line was printed into the soundtrack area, and it can cause actually a little bit of clipping or distortion in the sound area. Since picture and sound are printed from separate elements of one strip for the creation of the release print, similar process with the anaglyph, it adds to the way that there might be some registration issues with it. Finally, I also did some research and discovered an older review of the film, though not necessarily from this print that we're showing you here tonight, where the author noted a variable quality to the 3D effects, with some shots working and others not so much. But all that said, and all the technical stuff aside, the film still stands up and remains a great example of 3D from an era past.
Thank you. So just before the screening starts, I'd like to just reveal some items that we also have in our collection that relate to the film, and they're part of the library's collection. And after the screening, please feel free to take a closer look. It's the original mask. So it's quite a treasure. And I'd also like to invite you to visit our library when you get a chance, and our Canadian Film Gallery. There's a gallery attached to the library. The purpose of the gallery is to really highlight Canadian film works. And right now we have on a display called Otherworldly that I curated, and it's the art of Canadian costume design. And it showcases incredible work done by Canadian costume designers in the genres of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror films. And that's the little postcard we handed out to you. So, on with the film. Have your glasses ready. And when you hear put the mask on, put your glasses on, and please enjoy. Thank you so much for coming, and please roll the film.
The 2015 screening of The Mask was a DCP of the restoration and looked and sounded fantastic. And audiences were given red-blue anaglyph Polaroid viewers to watch the 3D sequences when the lead character is pressured by the mask to stick it on and get high. In the following pre-screening intro excerpt from the book launch, you'll hear Canadian horror film co-editor Loiselle describe Rothman as a filmmaker somewhat trapped in a country at a time when commercial and even cult success were frowned upon. Loiselle and Freitag's book features a variety of essays and horror films by many writers, including a contribution by Calum Vanstall and Rue Morgue contributors James Burrell, Andrea Subissati, Paul Corupe, and myself. So yes, there's a bit of shameful self-promotion embedded within this podcast. My piece is tied to the 1977 slasher Rituals, also known as The Creeper, and like Fruit's Death Weekend, the film and its director, Peter Carter, were poo-pooed by critics for making a nasty, nihilistic revenge tale where only one man survives out of a substantive group. Loiselle provides an amusing but fact-filled background on Rothman's film and its unusual route to cinema screens in Canada and the United States, and those wanting greater info on Rothman and Fruit should consult Vanstall's book, as well as Jason Pakonski's commentary on Kino's Mask Blu-ray and DVD, which covers cast, crew, the Toronto locations, technical details, and veteran montage expert Slavko Vorkapich's non-involvement with the trippy and fairly lengthy 3D sequences.
Put the mask on now. Put the mask on now.
The film you're going going to see tonight, The Mask, was actually restored by TIFF and the 3D Film Archive, so you're going to see it in it'll be brand spanking new. We're going to have a special introduction by the two editors of the book. First off, I'd like to introduce Gina Freitag. She's an independent scholar who has an MA degree in film studies at Carleton. She's done a lot of work on female archetypes in the horror film, and she's also the founder and co-organizer of the Cellar Door Film Festival in Ottawa, and I think she has the best title in any of the essays in the book, the, in brackets, horrible nature of things, a cultural dialogue on environmental survival. Please join me in welcoming Gina Freitag.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Steve. And welcome to the book launch and the screening. I just wanted to thank everyone for showing up and to thank all the organizers and contributors, especially the book's contributors that were able to make the screening tonight. I believe that includes Andrea Subissati, Scott Birdwise, and is there anyone else I'm missing? Okay.
That's Paul Corupe.
Okay, there we go.
And
James Burrell.
Oh, great, okay.
And Marcus Hassan.
And of course, also, we wanted to thank the University of Toronto Press, TIFF, and the organizers with TIFF Bell Lightbox. So tonight we introduce a text that has been several years in the making, a collection that highlights and celebrates more than a century of Canadian horror filmmaking, from the 1913 release of The Werewolf until now. This book is a reflection on Canada's terror of the soul, a phrase originally used by Canadian literary critic and literary theorist Northrop Frye, in particular regards to Canadian poetry. Frye wrote of a tension existing between the terrifying outside and the unbearable inside, of a tone of deep terror in regard to nature. It is not a terror of the dangers or discomforts or even the mysteries of nature, but a terror of the soul at something that these things manifest. The human mind has nothing but human and moral values to cling to if it is to preserve its integrity or even its sanity. Yet the vast unconsciousness of nature in front of it seems an unanswerable denial of these values. Confronted with a huge, unthinking, menacing, and formidable physical setting, such communities are bound to develop what we may provisionally call a garrison mentality. The real terror comes when the individual feels himself becoming an individual, pulling away from the group, losing the sense of driving power that the group gives him, aware of a conflict within himself far subtler than the struggle of morality against evil. And so with this, Frye describes the Canadian psyche, his commentary on the peculiar anxieties that have apparently shaped the Canadian imagination. And this is something which we have found to be just as apparent in Canadian horror cinema, in how our filmmakers envision and express Canadian culture, a terror of the soul at what we fantasize ourselves to be. The resulting images are often disturbing ones, filled with malicious civility, brutal modesty, and cruel tolerance. An ordinary wasteland of docile damnation and prosaic pestilence, where savage beasts and mad scientists rub elbows with pasty suburbanites and baby-faced porn stars. Over the course of the anthology's 13 chapters, we offer a discourse of paradoxes where familiar places lose their proper names, where monsters behave like self-righteous victims, and where heroes prove to be perverts. Amidst all of this is the centripetal iconography of a monstrously protective homestead, invoking what Frye identifies as the garrison mentality. Conceptualizations of small, isolated communities set against the wilderness, which soon become the interval between external threat and internal dread. And while some films explicitly depict such imagery, like that of Ginger Snaps Back, 2004, Grant Harvey, other films modernize the image with urban settings, like apartment buildings or office towers, like that of Shivers, 1975, by David Cronenberg. Cronenberg has been a major proponent behind the conventional tropes of Canadian horror, as you know, depicting unsettling neuroses of all kinds. Anxiety around technological progress, fixations on emasculation, paralyzing insecurity before creativity and innovation, and a need to hide violence and perversion behind the veil of good conduct and respectability. But aside from the Cronenbergian, few other entries in the Canadian horror cinema have attracted such substantial scholarly attention, save for such international hits as Cube, the 1997 film by Vincenzo Natali, Ginger Snaps from 2000 by John Fawcett, and Black Christmas from 1974 by Bob Clark. But from the perspective of this anthology, Canadian horror cinema offers so many more films worthy of attention as they too unsettle this mundane civil society with threats. This book begins with a general consideration of the diversity of Canadian monsters, and follows with a consideration of crushing imposition of American culture. It examines the collective imagination as interpreted through literature and adapted into cinematic representations. And it takes an historical look at gory slashers of the tax shelter era. It also reflects on the legendary malevolence of our indifferent environment in eco-horror, as well as on animation and the avant-garde as unexpected vehicles for the macabre. And finally, we conclude with an homage of sorts in the single most important figure of Canadian horror cinema, David Cronenberg. And it is our hope tonight, and in reading the book overall, that in fleshing out the nuances of Canadian horror cinema from a critical perspective, that readers and audiences will also uncover the obscure sources, intricate manifestations of the deep terror of the soul that petrifies the Canadian imagination. Andre, if you'd like to step up. Andre Loiselle, the other co-editor, will maybe introduce the screening at this point.
It's a real thrill to be welcome back Andrea Loiselle. We worked with him on a Michel Brault retrospective, one of the best retrospectives we did at TIFF a couple of years ago. He's a professor of film studies and assistant vice president at Carleton. He specializes in writing and studying Canadian and Quebecois cinema. I think we have 4 or 5 of his books downstairs in the bookstore, including his study of Denis Arcand's Decline of the American Empire and Barbarian Invasions, which was published through University of Toronto Press. And we also have one of the best books TIFF actually published, Cinema's History, Michel Brault and Modern Quebec, which actually relates Brault's cinema to the historical context it emerged out of. So please join me in welcoming Andrea Loiselle.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. I especially want to thank my wife and her aunt and uncle who are here tonight, even if they do not like, one might even say, even if they hate horror films. They're not fans, but they decided to be here to support me. And I also told them that The Mask, although it is a horror film, is not particularly scary at all. So that sort of convinced them to come. If The Mask is not necessarily the scariest horror films you'll ever see, it's a fun film. It's not particularly scary. It is a very important Canadian film. And I'm grateful to TIFF for finally making this film more widely available, because it definitely is worth looking at and appreciating for the value that it has. As you probably know, if you've read anything at all about The Mask, it is the first feature-length English-Canadian horror film ever made in 1961. It is also the first 3D Canadian film ever made, so it does have these sorts of firsts that are worth bringing it to our attention. But beyond that, it is actually more than just a gimmicky film. There's much more to it than that. And there's a few things that I want to talk about. First of all, it was really the only Canadian film in the 1960s to have any circulation at all in the US. And it actually was the top grossing Canadian films of the 1960s. Those things are usually not talked about. It's not that they're not important, but it is that there has been a discourse in Canadian cinema, and I promise I will not bore you for very long with this, but I can't help it. There's been a discourse in Canadian cinema that has tended to ignore, purposefully reject films that were commercially successful and film that looked too much like American films. So almost by definition, the fact that Rothman's film had been circulated in the States in the 60s, and even worse, the fact that it actually made money, excluded it from the canon of Canadian cinema, according to some scholars who were very, very influential. It's not as though The Mask was the only Canadian film circulating in the US. There were a number of Canadian films circulating in the US at the time. But the Canadian films that were praised as Canadian and that had some circulation in the US and in Canada tended to be of a very specific type. All I have to say, perhaps, is Nobody Wave Goodbye. Anyone who's taken a course on Canadian cinema knows Nobody Wave Goodbye. Iconic film, canonical film, everybody talks about it because it is distinctly Canadian. It looks like a documentary, was originally a documentary, really. It is cheaply made. It doesn't really adopt any of the conventions of evil Hollywood films. It has a totally open-ending narrative. And it only circulated in the art cinema club environment. Now, Nobody Will Wave Goodbye was seen by important people. Famously, Francis Ford Coppola saw it when he was very young and was quite influenced by it. So I don't want to talk too much against Nobody Wave Goodbye, but it's important to keep in mind that films like Nobody Wave Goodbye that became canonized sort of eclipsed other films like The Mask, because The Mask happened to look too much like an American film. And worse yet, it happened to have made money. It is very important now to start re-embracing those films, and tonight is not the first time that, commercial Canadian films have been sort of re-embraced by film scholars. I pretend to be a film scholar. It's been going on for a little while, but much more remains to be done. And I think that that's one of the things that our book contributes to, is to pay serious scholarly attention to films that have tended to be ignored because they don't fit in the canon of what has been understood as Canadian cinema, because they are horror films, because they're not respectable, because they look a little bit too American for their own good. I think that after about 60 years, or let's say 55 years of Canadian cinema, now we've reached a point where we don't have to be too concerned about what is Canadian and what isn't. We do have a very solid cinema now, and now we can start to re-embrace the film that perhaps 20, 30 years ago we would have been a bit more concerned about talking about, because we would have been afraid that by embracing those films, we would have given up on a distinct Canadian cinema. Now that we're much more comfortable, we do have a bunch of big names. We have a minor film festival, I think, here in Toronto that takes place in September, I think. So there are good things about Canadian cinema, and one of the good things is that now we actually feel more confident to embrace a wide range of films, even if those films are perhaps not quite as distinctly Canadian as things such as Nobody Wave Goodbye or Going Down the Road. Or are they? Is The Mask not as distinctively Canadian as Nobody Wave Goodbye? One of the things that we try to argue in the book is that many of those horror films that on the surface seem to have nothing to say about Canada actually deal with our fears. Maybe not uniquely Canadian fears, but typically Canadian fears. That's one of the things that we're trying to talk about. That those horror films really are somewhat distinctly Canadian. The Mask, I would argue, is distinctly Canadian in very, very many ways. On the face of it, it's a film about drug addiction, it seems to me. But if you dig a bit deeper, there's all sorts of Canadian fears in this. The one that's most interesting to me is what The Mask represents. The Mask is this foreign influence that, when you put it on, imposes sensationalist images on your innocent eyes. This is definitely one way of interpreting the film. And I think, not that I have any evidence of this, but I think that Cronenberg must have seen The Mask, because I see a direct link between The Mask and Videodrome. And if you happen to have seen the Videodrome and its slightly more obvious statement about foreign images being imposed on Canadians, if you remember that, then think about The Mask and you'll see something that is very similar. Last thing I want to mention, you all have your little glasses. The film is very clever in telling you exactly when we're going to see 3D. Whenever you hear, put the mask on. That's amusing, but there's also something about this voice from elsewhere that compels you to put glasses on to see the world from a certain perspective. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that Rothman was actually trying to say something about Canadian spectatorship. Maybe, maybe not. But definitely, whenever you hear put the mask on, do put your glasses on, and then you'll see some of the most phenomenal images in the history of Canadian cinema. On this, enjoy the movie. Thank you very much.
Related film reviews such as Kino's 3D The Mask Blu-ray and further details on the Canadian horror film Terror of the Soul, plus order links are available at KQEK.com. Coming soon, a podcast interview with the reigning American composer Nima Fakrara, who discusses music for the horror film The Girl in the Photographs and scoring the interactive online game 1979 Revolution, Black Friday. And finally, some quick notes on the visuals within this podcast. Because the first intro extract was recorded with an older Sony digital recorder that employed a ridiculous amount of compression, I chose to apply a visual scheme that was appropriately lo-fi and grubby. The use of an old oscilloscope and color effects kind of evokes, in my eyes at least, a color etching that was perhaps overbuffed with an SOS pad and too much scouring powder. The cleaner audio in the second extract is derived from rows of patterns created by a 1976 Atari video music device, an early video synthesizer that delivers weird blocky geopatterns and a variety of blazing analog colors as triggered by stereo audio. For additional information on the creation of this podcast's imagery and to inquire about having your own audio custom processed via vintage analog gear, please visit bigheadamusements.com. HD extracts from the preceding visuals are also available on Big Head Amusements' Vimeo and YouTube channels. If you like this podcast, please visit KQEK.com's Facebook page and follow our Twitter feed at mondomark_KQEK. All podcasts are available via Libsyn, iTunes, and YouTube. The editorial skills responsible for this podcast are also available for hire. If you require audio editing, mixing, and cleaning up interview recordings prior to publication, please visit mondomark.com for more info and to hear demo reels. Until next time, this is Mark R. Hassan, editor of KQEK.com.